September 13th, 1940, 11:05 hours. Buckingham Palace, London. Queen Elizabeth was in her sitting room on the first floor, reviewing correspondence with her private secretary when the air raid warning sounded. Not unusual, sirens had become the soundtrack of London life since the Blitz began. But this time, the aircraft engines were close, unusually close, and growing closer. She looked up from her desk toward the windows overlooking the forecourt. Through the glass, she could see the morning sky, grey with typical London weather. Then she saw them, two German bombers, Heinkel 111s, flying low over the mall, so low she could see the black crosses on their wings. Her private secretary grabbed her arm. "Ma'am, we must—" The first bomb hit before he could finish. The explosion threw them both to the floor. Windows shattered inward in a spray of glass that filled the air like crystalline rain. The walls shook. Plaster dust cascaded from the ceiling. For a moment, everything was noise and chaos and the acrid smell of explosives. Then a second explosion, closer. The room's remaining windows blew out completely. A piece of masonry crashed through where the Queen had been sitting moments before, destroying her desk and scattering correspondence across the floor. The private secretary, still gripping her arm, pulled her toward the corridor. "The shelter, Your Majesty, quickly." As they rushed through hallways filling with smoke and dust, staff members emerged from rooms looking shocked, but maintaining the composure that characterized palace service even during bombardment. A footman stood calmly by a shattered window, checking for fires. A housemaid was sweeping broken glass into a neat pile, as if tidying after a party rather than a bombing. King George VI met them in the corridor, emerging from his own rooms. His face was calm, but his eyes showed the controlled anger of a man whose home had just been attacked while he was in it. "Are you hurt?" he asked his wife. "No, shaken, but unharmed. You?" "Quite well, though the chapel is destroyed, I'm told. Direct hit." They descended to the palace's reinforced shelter, not the elaborate underground facility advisors had urged them to use, but a modest basement room that offered minimal protection. The king had refused more substantial arrangements, insisting that if Londoners sheltered in tube stations and basement cupboards, the royal family would endure similar conditions. As they sat in the shelter, listening to further explosions in the distance, the king was unusually quiet. Finally, he spoke, his voice measured and thoughtful, despite his stammer. "I'm glad we've been bombed. Now I can look the East End in the face." The Queen understood immediately. For weeks, the Luftwaffe had been bombing London's working-class neighbourhoods with devastating intensity. Thousands of East Enders had lost homes, lost family members, lost everything. The royal family had visited bombed areas, had expressed sympathy, had tried to show solidarity. But there was always the unspoken gap. The king and queen in their palace, the people in their rubble. Now, Buckingham Palace was rubble too. The gap had closed. The refusal. The bombing of Buckingham Palace on September 13th, 1940, wasn't the first attack on the palace grounds. There had been previous near misses, but this was different. 5 bombs in total. 2 hitting the forecourt, 1 destroying the chapel, 2 more landing in the garden. The intent was clear. This was deliberate targeting of Britain's most visible symbol of national unity. The damage was extensive. The palace chapel, a Victorian structure of considerable historical and sentimental value, was effectively destroyed. Windows throughout the palace were shattered. Structural damage affected multiple rooms. Had the king and queen been in different locations moments earlier, they might have been killed. The attack created immediate pressure on the royal family to evacuate London entirely. Government advisors, security officials, and well-meaning courtiers urged relocation to Windsor Castle at minimum, preferably to a safer location in Scotland or even Canada. The Princesses Elizabeth and Margaret were already at Windsor. Surely the King and Queen should join them and govern from safety rather than risk further attacks. The arguments were logical. The King's life was valuable beyond his personal safety. He was head of state, symbol of national continuity, essential for maintaining constitutional order. His death in a bombing raid would damage British morale and create succession complications. Protection of the monarch wasn't selfish, but necessary for the nation's welfare. King George VI refused. The refusal wasn't dramatic or defiant. It was characteristically British, understated, practical, and absolute. He explained to his private secretary that abandoning London while the city was under sustained bombardment would send the wrong message. The monarchy's role was to exemplify national character. British character meant staying put during difficulty, maintaining calm under pressure, and sharing burdens rather than avoiding them. "The children will not leave without me," Queen Elizabeth stated firmly when the evacuation suggestion was repeated to her. "I will not leave without the King, and the King will never leave." This wasn't rhetoric. It was statement of intention that would define royal conduct for the duration of the Blitz. Buckingham Palace would remain occupied. The King and Queen would sleep there most nights, even as bombs continued falling. They would continue their duties from London rather than relocating to safety. They would demonstrate through presence rather than proclamation that they shared their people's danger. The East End solidarity. The King's comment about being able to look the East End in the face was more than momentary reflection. It became guiding principle for royal conduct during the Blitz. London's East End had been devastated by bombing since the Blitz began. The docks, warehouses, and working-class neighborhoods had been primary targets, suffering casualties and destruction far exceeding what West End or Westminster had experienced. East Enders had borne the brunt of German bombing while living in overcrowded conditions with inadequate shelter facilities. The class dimension was impossible to ignore. Working-class Londoners suffered in cramped tube stations and basement shelters, while aristocracy and government officials had access to better protection. Some East Enders had expressed bitter resentment. "It's our homes getting bombed while they sit safe in their mansions." The bombing of Buckingham Palace changed that dynamic profoundly. Now the palace, the most aristocratic residence in Britain, had been hit just like East End tenements. The King and Queen had experienced bombardment just like dock workers and shop assistants. The shared danger created shared experience that transcended class boundaries in uniquely British fashion. The day after the bombing, the Queen visited bombed areas in the East End. She walked through streets still smoking from the previous night's raid, spoke with families who'd lost homes, inspected community shelters, and maintained her characteristic composure throughout. One woman, serving tea in a bombed community center, offered the Queen a cup from a chipped teacup, all they had left. The Queen accepted it, drank, and thanked her hostess with the same courtesy she'd show at a state dinner. The gesture was photographed and became iconic, royalty sharing tea with ordinary Londoners amid the ruins, demonstrating that titles meant nothing when everyone faced the same bombs. "I can look them in the face now," the Queen wrote in her diary that evening. "We've all been bombed. We're all in this together." This wasn't condescension or calculated public relations. It was genuine recognition that shared danger created shared identity. The bombing of Buckingham Palace had paradoxically strengthened the monarchy by making it more human, more accessible, more clearly part of the nation rather than separate from it. The quiet courage. The response of the king and queen to having their home bombed exemplified the characteristically British approach to crisis, understated determination rather than theatrical defiance. King George VI did not make dramatic speeches about the bombing. He did not thunder about German barbarism or vow vengeance. He simply continued his duties with the same steady competence he'd shown before the attack, adding only the observation that being bombed helped him understand what his subjects were experiencing. Queen Elizabeth's response was similarly restrained. She expressed no fear, showed no desire for revenge, made no grand gestures of defiance. She simply carried on, visiting bombed areas, supporting civil defense services, maintaining palace routines despite the damage, and refusing to treat the attack as anything more than an inconvenience requiring practical adjustment. This restraint was itself a form of courage more powerful than bombast. It communicated that German bombing, while dangerous and destructive, couldn't force changes in behavior or create panic. The palace had been hit, and the response was to carry on as before. Bombs might break windows, but couldn't break composure. The palace staff exemplified the same quality. After the bombing, they cleaned up broken glass, covered shattered windows with boards, and resumed normal duties with minimal fuss. The king's valet laid out his uniform as usual. The Queen's lady-in-waiting organized her schedule as if nothing had happened. Tea was served at the regular time from undamaged china, maintaining standards because maintaining standards was what one did. This determined normality under abnormal circumstances was peculiarly British. Where other cultures might respond to crisis with emotional catharsis or revolutionary fervor, the British response was to put the kettle on, sweep up the debris, and carry on with a stiff upper lip. The monarchy embodied this approach perfectly, demonstrating through example what was expected of British character under pressure. The symbolic impact. The bombing's psychological impact on British morale exceeded its physical impact on the palace. German strategy assumed that destroying visible symbols would demoralize populations. Bombing Buckingham Palace, the ultimate symbol of British establishment and tradition, should have created despair or panic. Instead, it created determination. The reasoning was characteristically British. If even Buckingham Palace could be bombed, then clearly no one was safe. So there was no point in special resentment about one's own circumstances. More importantly, if the king and queen could endure bombing and carry on calmly, then ordinary citizens could do the same. The monarchy's example set the standard for expected behavior. Letters flooded to the palace expressing solidarity. Working-class Londoners wrote saying they were glad the palace had been hit because now the king understood what they faced. Middle-class citizens expressed admiration for the royal family's refusal to evacuate. Soldiers overseas wrote that knowing the king and queen stayed in London despite danger made them proud to be fighting for Britain. The German propaganda response was telling. Berlin initially crowed about hitting the palace, presenting it as proof of Luftwaffe invincibility. But when British morale didn't collapse, when instead the bombing seemed to strengthen national unity, German propagandists shifted to claiming the attack had been accidental or insignificant. The propaganda confusion revealed that the attack had backfired strategically. British newspapers, operating under censorship, reported the bombing matter-of-factly. Palace hit, royal family safe, damage being repaired. But the subtext was clear in every article. Our king and queen remain in London, sharing our danger. And if they can endure with calm courage, so can we. The continued presence. The bombing didn't end German attacks on London. The Blitz continued for months, but the King and Queen's response to the September 13th attack established pattern that would continue throughout. They slept at Buckingham Palace most nights, despite continued bombing. When air raids occurred, they'd retire to the modest palace shelter, wait out the attack, then resume activities. They didn't make a show of their presence. There were no publicity stunts or dramatic pronouncements. They were simply there, doing their duty, sharing London's danger. The Queen visited bombed areas almost daily, walking through rubble, speaking with rescue workers, inspecting community shelters, and maintaining her characteristic composure throughout. She didn't deliver speeches or make grand gestures. She simply showed up, spoke with people, listened to their concerns, and demonstrated through presence that the monarchy cared about ordinary citizens' welfare. The King awarded medals to civil defense workers, firefighters, and air raid wardens with increasing frequency. He visited anti-aircraft batteries, inspected bomb damage, and met with troops preparing for overseas deployment. His stammer, which had been a source of personal embarrassment, somehow made his speeches more powerful because audiences could see him struggling to deliver every word rather than glibly reading prepared text. This sustained presence over months of bombing created cumulative psychological impact far exceeding any single dramatic gesture. The monarchy's quiet persistence demonstrated that British institutions and values could withstand assault, that national character was stronger than enemy action, and that doing one's duty, regardless of danger, was the expected standard of behavior. The German frustration. For German strategic planners, the bombing of Buckingham Palace and its aftermath represented failure of fundamental assumptions about British society. The Luftwaffe had believed that destroying symbols would destroy morale. But Britain's response suggested that physical symbols mattered less than the ideas they represented. You could bomb the palace, but the monarchy's actual function, providing national unity and exemplifying desired character traits, didn't depend on buildings remaining intact. German intelligence reports documented this with frustration. Intercepted communications showed British morale remaining high despite sustained bombing. Monitoring of British radio broadcasts revealed no panic, no calls for surrender, no political pressure to negotiate peace. Instead, there was grim determination and even dark humor about the situation. Captured Luftwaffe crew members expressed confusion. They'd been told British were soft, that bombing would break civilian will quickly. Instead, they found a population that absorbed tremendous punishment while maintaining function. The bombing of Buckingham Palace specifically should have created despair, but seemed instead to have strengthened national unity. One captured bomber pilot later testified, "We were told the British would crack if we bombed hard enough. We destroyed entire neighborhoods, killed thousands, even hit their palace. They just carried on. I couldn't understand it. Where was the breaking point? There didn't seem to be one." This incomprehension reflected fundamental German misunderstanding of British psychology. The Nazis assumed that destroying symbols would destroy what they symbolized. They didn't grasp that British identity was based less on physical objects than on behavioral standards: the stiff upper lip, the calm under pressure, the determination to carry on regardless. You couldn't bomb behavioral standards out of existence. The class transformation. The palace bombing contributed to broader social transformation occurring during the Blitz. The temporary reduction of class barriers through shared danger. Before the war, British society was rigidly stratified. The monarchy, aristocracy, and working classes inhabited different worlds with limited interaction. The idea of genuine equality seemed impossible given structural class divisions. The Blitz created forced equality. German bombs didn't discriminate by class. East End tenements and West End mansions both burned. Tube shelters mixed duchesses and dock workers. Civil defence required cooperation across class lines. And when Buckingham Palace was bombed, the ultimate symbol of aristocratic privilege became just another damaged building requiring repair. The King and Queen's response accelerated this transformation. By refusing to evacuate, by sleeping in a basic shelter rather than elaborate underground facilities, by visiting bombed areas and expressing genuine solidarity with victims, they demonstrated that class privilege didn't exempt anyone from national duty or shared danger. This wasn't revolutionary leveling. Britain remained class-conscious even during the Blitz, but it was temporary suspension of some barriers, a recognition that in crisis, what mattered was character rather than background. The monarchy's role in modelling this attitude was crucial because it came from the top of the social hierarchy, endorsing cooperation rather than being imposed against aristocratic resistance. The Queen's comment about being able to look the East End in the face captured this perfectly. She wasn't claiming to be working class or pretending class differences didn't exist. She was acknowledging that shared experience of bombing created shared identity stronger than class divisions, and that the monarchy's duty was to embody national unity rather than maintain social distance. The legacy, the bombing of Buckingham Palace and the royal family's response became foundational element of wartime British mythology that would influence national self-conception for generations. The image of the king and queen calmly enduring danger alongside their subjects became shorthand for ideal leadership, present, calm, sharing burdens rather than avoiding them. This contrasted powerfully with leaders who fled or demanded special protection and established standard by which future British leadership would be judged. The phrase, "I can look the East End in the face," entered national vocabulary as expression of moral equality earned through shared suffering. It captured the idea that leadership required experiencing what followers experienced. That authority derived partly from willingness to share burdens rather than imposing them from safety. For King George VI, personally, the palace bombing paradoxically strengthened a monarchy that had seemed shaky after Edward VIII's abdication in 1936. George had never sought to be king, had struggled with his stammer and self-doubt, and had taken the throne reluctantly. But his conduct during the Blitz, the steady presence, the quiet courage, the refusal to seek special safety, proved he possessed exactly the character Britain needed during crisis. Queen Elizabeth's wartime conduct established her as beloved national figure whose popularity would endure for decades. Her combination of genuine concern for ordinary people with maintenance of proper standards, her calm competence under pressure, and her subtle humor in difficult circumstances created image of ideal British womanhood that influenced expectations for generations. The broader legacy was establishment of monarchy's modern role, not ruling, but exemplifying, not commanding, but encouraging, not separate from the nation, but embedded within it. The palace bombing demonstrated that this model could work even under the most extreme pressure, that constitutional monarchy could fulfill meaningful function by providing symbolic unity and behavioral example rather than exercising direct power. The physical restoration of Buckingham Palace took years. Full repairs weren't completed until after the war ended, but the symbolic restoration was immediate. The morning after the bombing, staff began clearing debris with the same systematic efficiency they'd apply to any cleaning task. Windows were boarded over. Damaged rooms were sealed off. Essential functions continued in undamaged sections. The palace remained operational even while undergoing repair. The Union Jack continued flying over the palace whenever the king was in residence, a daily signal to Londoners that their monarch remained in the capital. On days of particularly heavy bombing damage, seeing that flag still flying became reassurance that Britain endured, that institutions survived, that national continuity persisted despite German attempts to destroy it. The destroyed chapel couldn't be rebuilt during wartime. Resources were needed elsewhere. But the rubble was carefully documented and preserved, creating record of what had been lost and testament to what had been survived. After the war, the chapel was rebuilt, incorporating elements salvaged from the bombing as deliberate reminders of wartime sacrifice. The palace gardens, damaged by bomb craters and debris, were partially converted to grow vegetables as part of the Dig for Victory campaign. This practical use of royal grounds for food production symbolized the total national mobilization required for war effort and demonstrated that even palatial spaces served practical purposes during crisis. The final truth. The bombing of Buckingham Palace on September 13, 1940, was intended to demoralize Britain by destroying its most visible symbol of tradition and stability. It failed completely. The failure came not from British propaganda or government manipulation, but from the simple fact that Britain's strength didn't reside in buildings. It resided in character, in the determination to carry on, regardless of difficulty, in the refusal to panic under pressure, in the maintenance of standards even when easier to abandon them. King George VI and Queen Elizabeth exemplified this character perfectly. They didn't make grand speeches about their decision to stay in London. They didn't engage in theatrical defiance. They simply stayed, did their duty, shared their people's danger, and demonstrated through quiet example what British character meant. The bombs could destroy the palace chapel. They could shatter windows and crack walls. They couldn't break the calm determination of a king who insisted he was glad to be bombed because it let him share his subjects' experience. They couldn't shake the composure of a queen who drank tea from chipped cups amid the rubble and maintained standards because maintaining standards was what civilized people did. The German bombers that attacked Buckingham Palace on that September morning achieved nothing strategically. They destroyed a building that could be repaired. They strengthened the very morale they'd hoped to destroy. They proved that British resilience came from culture rather than architecture, from character rather than circumstances. And in the palace shelter, sitting on uncomfortable chairs while bombs fell overhead, the king and queen demonstrated what would become the defining image of British wartime leadership. Not heroic or dramatic, but steady, present, and absolutely unshakable. Exactly the leadership Britain needed, and exactly the example that would echo through generations as proof that doing one's duty, regardless of danger, was the highest form of courage.